be a recording. And all right, so the recording started. Again, appreciate everybody here today. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity trends in 2021, and what we're going to be looking at here in just a moment are the big risks, because a lot of the landscape in the last year has changed. COVID, I heard some commentators say, has accelerated the timeline on everything. So things that might happen in a decade happened in a few months. And unfortunately, that's also true in the world of cyber criminals and cybersecurity. But first, let's just get a couple things out of the way. And I also want to apologize that the first part of this is going to be a little depressing and maybe nerve-wracking, but this is just serious stuff. Cybersecurity is never a fun topic, but it is a very important and relevant topic. So let's go ahead and get to the next slide. There we go. So smaller is worse, unfortunately. I imagine most of you on this call are in small, maybe medium-sized organizations. I doubt we have anybody from the Fortune 500 or big companies on this webinar today. And smaller is worse. And the reason is because you've got a greater vulnerability, you've got fewer resources for defense. Hackers know that you've got that, so they're going to target you as kind of an easy mark. And quite frankly, you got much more to lose, because big corporations not only have IT security teams, they've got millions of dollars, they've got teams of high-priced attorneys to defend them against inevitable lawsuits and things that may arise. So they've got just a built-in cushion. They can take more hits than the rest of us. I mean, in some cases, especially maybe if you're just getting started, it doesn't take much to knock you out. Cash flow's keen and all that. So smaller is worse, especially in the field of cybersecurity. So what we have to do is look to leverage tools and things that can give us the power of the big folks, but still at a budget and cost we can afford. And cybersecurity is not optional. A few years ago, what we would all do is we would all say, hey, well, look, do you have antivirus on your computer systems? Do you have good backups? Probably you got a server or two at the office. Do you have good backups on that? Do you know they could be restored? Hopefully they're sending off-site. Do you have a good firewall at your offices as well? And if you had those things, that was 90% there. We talk about passwords and things, and obviously being skeptical and spam emails. Over the last few years, we've added in the spam filtering as something that's just really not optional for a variety of reasons. But now we're looking at needing more. That's not enough. And this is not something that we can just stick our heads in the sand and say, well, it has never happened to me. It hasn't happened to any company I know. I'm going to be fine. But more and more, I searched through tons of headlines and saw, law firm breaches and all sorts of just nastiness. And the cyber criminals have been pretty active too, because it is a game of cat and mouse with these folks. So we've got some new major risks we need to talk about, including some things that you're going to sit there and say, yeah, I know about that, but I'm going to tell you about some interesting twists that have happened, especially in the last 12 months in these things, that makes us even more worried about these attacks and what the damage they can do to small organizations like we have. So let's look at these. And if you don't have any coffee, hopefully you have quick access to some, or can get you somebody to bring you some, because if you're a coffee person, you're probably going to need some to make it through these next few slides. So ransomware. Goodness, I tell you what, the day that I don't have to talk about ransomware is going to be a glorious day, but it shows no signs that that's going to be anytime soon, because if you don't know what ransomware is, let's just give a breakdown. So hopefully, most of you on this call have not been affected. I did look at the registration list, and unfortunately I spotted at least one that has been, so I'm very sorry. But ransomware is just a nasty malware, so think of it kind of like a virus that encrypts your files and all other files that whatever the encrypted PC or encrypted user has access to on the network. And now, when we talk about encryption, what we mean is the files get scrambled. And there's always a key to decrypt these things. It's a little virtual key, of course, but it's a key. And when we talk about things like encrypting your systems or encrypting emails, well, your computer or your email system has that decryption key. So if the right passcode or whatever it is put in, it will decrypt. But you have access in the cases of if we've set up encryption on your individual machines at your office. Parkway Tech securely stores that encryption key, the decryption key for your systems. But here, the hackers have that decryption key. That's the only way. And it's even worse because not only are whoever's machine was affected is encrypted, but it's going to spread to whatever they have access to on like a file share, network drive on your servers. And then usually the ransomware will also try to spread throughout the network to other computer systems. So, I mean, in short order, you can find things like your banking records, client records, databases, payroll records, all those sorts of things, all encrypted. You can't open them unless you have backups. Now, that used to be a reason that we said, hey, well, you just need to make sure you have backups. I mean, this stuff just gets put on there. But ransomware is on the rise. It's becoming more and more prevalent, even against small businesses, although the ones that make the news are obviously large businesses. I think the city of Pensacola was affected a couple of years ago. Last year, I know it was some hospital systems. In fact, these hackers are so brazen and awful that they were actively targeting hospital systems during these COVID outbreaks. But ransomware is also getting much more expensive. So used to be about $2,500 to $5,000, maybe $10,000 we'd see in these ransom requests from these hackers for small businesses, and that would be payable in Bitcoin since it's largely untraceable. But, well, we're not seeing that anymore. I'm going to quote, by the way, the figures I'm quoting here, if I quote any monetary figures, I'm quoting for like small organizations, 15 to 50. These are not big corporation numbers that are skewing my numbers at all. And we do have good data on this thanks to insurance carriers and things like that you have to pay out or happen to find out about these things. So now we're looking at about $50,000 to $75,000 on average. That's pretty expensive, and I don't know about you, but that'd be a pretty big hit to my budget. And also then, too, the fact that I'm enabling more cybercrime because these hackers are making millions of dollars off these ransoms that are paid doesn't even sit well with me. It doesn't leave me with a nice, good feeling. But the other issue with ransomware is that it's no longer an option just to restore from backups. Let me share a quote with you here from a noted security researcher. This is Brian Krebs, used to work for the Washington Post and has been on his own for years, but he's just a big guy in the world of cybersecurity. He's helped crack open some of these things and really has a lot of knowledge and is usually the one that we hear about these things from before anybody else. So he writes, previously when a victim of ransomware had adequate backups, they would just restore and go on with life. There was zero reason to even engage with the threat actor. So here's the hacker. Now, when a threat actor steals data, a company with perfectly restorable backups is often compelled to at least engage with the threat actor to determine what data was taken. That last sentence is the key. So ransomware has a new twist. It's no longer just encrypting your files and then you hoping to have a backup or hoping maybe you can scrape together the money for the ransom, and if you pay it, they'll be quick and get you the decryption key and you can get your files back. Now, hackers will take these files, transfer all the stuff that they have access to, and usually it's pretty broad on your network, transfer it back to their systems, and then they will unleash the ransomware. So I would equate this to somebody going in, being able to get into a bank undetected, take all the money out of the vault, and plant a bomb on their way out. The ransomware is the bomb that's going off. They've already been there. In fact, new studies that we've gotten from the past year show us that most hackers are in network 6 to 9 months before they're ever detected. And by the way, this includes like large organizations that have cybersecurity teams. So this is not just, oh, well, the reason they weren't detected is because nobody was even looking. It is incredibly tough to detect a skilled attacker, method of entry. It's incredibly tough to see who's in there. And it really takes required focus. And as much as I'd love to tell you there's just a bunch of log files we can go through, it's not the case. Your average computer is going to log thousands of events. Just an individual computer, not your entire network, is going to log thousands of events in their event logs, most of which are innocuous. Even things like errors are usually not actually an error, just like a transient thing. The program had a little bit of a problem. It self-recovered, but it had to write something to the log. So it's a lot tougher than ever to detect these things, which is why we want to keep it off. But again, now ransomware has two parts. So you're probably going to go something like this. If you get ransomware on your network, you'll be contacted by the hackers one way, whether it's a pop-up. In some cases, they actually have call centers and they'll call you now, believe it or not. And these folks will call you or reach out to you and say, hey, it's $50,000 to decrypt your files, and you better pay with Bitcoin, and you have 72 hours. Which, by the way, presents a problem if you don't have Bitcoin, because we've got quite an issue if that is the case. Because that can take 5 to 7 days to set that up. So even if you want to pay the ransom, you're going to be pretty limited. But then the hackers will do one of two things. So if you don't pay the ransom, they'll probably reach out to you through one of these call centers and say, hey, we've been in your network. We know you're restoring from your Shadow Protect backups, but just so you know, we've got some of your files. And by the way, here's some evidence of it. Here's some files. And we'll give you a couple of them to show that, yes, we actually have them. And we're going to release these, or we're going to sell these, or we're going to start contacting your customers. In some cases, these hackers are so brazen they will anonymously report themselves to like the state's attorney general of where you do business, and say, hey, so and so law firm had a breach, and you need to investigate that. I don't know if they've reported it yet, but they suffered a significant breach and ransomware incident, and a bunch of all their data was taken. That's how bad they've gotten. But then the awfulness doesn't end. So one way or another, they will come back to you and say, hey, so if you don't want this data to be leaked or sold, that's going to be another 50,000. And again, they'll provide proof that they have your files. And the issue becomes, how can you trust them? I mean, how will they not come back to you 6 months from now and say, hey, we'd like another 50 to not release this? That can be just a perpetual ransom at that point. Plus, you have to rely on the ethical nature of criminals, which is always a dicey play. So this brings us to the fact that ransomware is pretty much an extinction level event now for most small organizations, because between the ransom, between the fact that you may or may not have adequate backups, but even if you do, that's, they've exfiltrated your data, they've got it. The requirements of whoever you're going to have to notify, you're probably going to have to notify your employees. You're going to have to notify your clients, potentially your vendors. You're going to have to probably pay for some sort of credit monitoring. You're going to have the loss of reputation that comes from all this, the weeks spent trying to clean up, maybe do forensic analysis, trying to get your cyber insurance company to pay out. And let me tell you, cyber insurance is getting tougher and tougher to get payouts on, and they're requiring more and more. So this is a big deal. Ransomware is no longer it was a big annoyance before, because it might take 2 or 3 days to recover and you've got some lost time, but at least, you didn't worry that somebody had your data. As long as you had good backups, you could go on with life with a unnecessary and unwelcome interruption. But now it's bad. And also you've got to really probably pay some people to do forensic analysis, which is not cheap, because you want to know how long have they been in there. So before I move on to email, I'm going to check and just see if we've got any questions or anything in the chats. Okay, nothing yet. Good enough. All right. So email. Email is still the biggest attack vector. Still the #1 target. Keep saying this, but it's easy. They can mass send out these emails. So whether it's a virus, whether it's a phishing email, designed to get you to enter your credentials somewhere that's not actually what you think it is, whether it's your bank or Office 365, what have you. But we're also seeing these email accounts compromised. And more, it's much like those hackers, that they will sit on it for some number of months before you start to notice any activity that you normally would. It's a big deal. And they're covering their tracks too. They will make it look like, if you've got a business in North Carolina, they will make it look like, if they can't make it look like it comes from the traffic's coming from North Carolina with the logins, they'll make it look like it's coming from Virginia or something that's close enough that nobody's not going to raise alarm bells if you happen to be looking through those logs, which again, much like computer logs, Office 365 logs thousands of events if it's set up properly to log those things, and it's tough to kind of bring that stuff to the surface. And so with these accounts being compromised, you have to wonder, well, what else did they get? I mean, they were able to read my emails, and if it's maybe a partner at a law firm, it's could be really bad. And then, of course, the phishing and malware emails continue to be something that we see. If you're asking, hey, I have a spam filter, how do these things continue to slip through? The thing is, no spam filter can be 100%. It is a game of cat and mouse. It's why we look at different layered tools. We're testing out some things internally to kind of help with that, but it's just still quite a bit. I know most of you are probably on our Proofpoint email spam filtering service if you're a client and have spam filtering. I will tell you that I actually talked to a security researcher about a month ago, and I mentioned that that was who we were using, and he's like, oh, that's one of the top 5. That's awesome. So at least we know we're on the right track there, but still, we still have to be wary, right? Because occasionally stuff comes in. And anecdotally, in the last week and a half, I've seen my spam filter thankfully catching all this stuff, but I've seen just a massive increase in the amount of phishing emails and spam and potential malware that's getting stopped by the spam filter. So I don't know if they've got a new push or what's going on, but little anecdotal evidence that is not pleasing at all. All right, so let's look at regulation. Now, regulation is just always a risk because you don't know the costs or how it's going to affect your organization. That's the thing here. And what we're seeing is California and New York already have much more stringent data privacy and breach notification rules that they've enacted. A lot of those have not gone into effect yet. They're being A, litigated, and B, they wanted to give organizations time. But you don't have to have your business in one of those states. You just have to do a certain amount of business in those states. And some of it's still being determined because California's, I think, is a $25 million in sales requirement to be able to be subject to this, at least initially in the first wave. But they haven't made clear whether that's 25 million total in your organization across like everywhere that you do business, or if that's 25 million only in the state of California. But I imagine all the sort of kind of disparate thing, there's a tracker online that tries to keep track of what the different states do. North Carolina, as I know, you have to notify the Attorney General within 30 days of any sort of potential breach. And then go through some other steps. But these other ones are more stringent. So what I think we're going to see is some sort of national framework for this regulation. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say I expect it in about a couple of years because we're really coming to a head. We're seeing these attacks be more and more destructive. We're seeing a lot of businesses impacted, both large and small. Obviously, you may have heard about the whole SolarWinds hack recently. I actually did a video on that. If you haven't seen that yet, send me an email. I will have my contact information, by the way, at the end of the presentation, so you can get my email then. But send me an email if you want that. I don't have time to go into it. This presentation already had to be massively cut down so we could cover what we needed. But the SolarWinds hack was big. It affected tons of government agencies, tons of Fortune 500 companies, and caused probably billions of dollars in terms of disruption just already. And we still are seeing the effects weeks after. There's something new that came out yesterday that Malwarebytes was actually, I don't think their local system was, but their email was compromised through this whole thing. So I'm expecting some sort of national framework. Most of the other like G8 countries have some sort of national framework requirement. The UK, Australia already do. And if you're familiar with HIPAA at all, think something like that with increased costs of compliance, increased things your business has to do, and stiff fines and penalties for breaches. And the simple fact is, I imagine too, most of us on this call are subject to HIPAA in some way, whether we're a covered entity or a business associate. I know like we have to follow everything for HIPAA because we have clients who are covered entities under HIPAA. And that means that we have to follow the same rules and regulations, which are not inexpensive. So regulation's a big thing. Again, the more you can do now to prepare, the better off you'll be when that comes, because then you can just check it against your list of things you're doing and make sure everything lines up and make the necessary adjustments from there. Now, remote work. I don't know how many of you have enjoyed remote work, those of you that have been able to do it. We've enjoyed it. We've been at remote here at Parkway Tech for a few years, so it wasn't a big transition for us there, but it has caused us to make sure that we're revisiting all our security and doing the necessary protections. Securing 24 home networks for your employees just isn't feasible. And this presents a problem to kind of the traditional cybersecurity model where we would build up the office, or if you have multiple offices, we'd build those up, link them via VPN, and those would be kind of castles. So the office is a castle. We've got the firewall there guarding it. We've got antivirus. We've got other things. We've got, spam filtering now for email before anything comes in, and we're guarding that castle. If things get in, they should be good. But that model had already started to break down a bit with all the extra devices that are coming on to business networks. And now it's just been shattered by remote work because, you can't necessarily control what your employees have on their home networks, and they probably have children who are doing God knows what on computer systems that could present a problem. So it's requiring us to look at different things. So remote work isn't bad, but it definitely requires a new way of thinking. And I know some of you have reached out to me and say, hey, how can we even make sure, not from a risk perspective of hackers, but we make sure our employees are productive? And the good news is there's a lot of new tools out over the last 12 months that have really dropped the price from enterprise level pricing, which is like $30 to $40 per user per month for something like this that just monitors employee activity, to much more reasonable costs. Still not free or anything like that. Nothing I can unfortunately add into a service plan, but it's a lot more reasonable, a lot more doable. To be able to see what your employees are doing and to limit activity. So limit things like saving to USB drives, that sort of thing, as well as tracking, what files they're opening, what they're transferring, things like that. And then we also need to talk about securing data in the event of an employee separation. I know many of you have told me that for most of your organizations, even once more folks can return to the office, you fully expect that not everyone will be able to. And I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. That, whether somebody's moved away or somebody just really enjoys working from home and that's about the only way you can keep them in your employ, that's fine. But what are you going to do when they've got a work laptop and you've got to fire them? How's that plan work now? How are you going to secure the data? How are you going to not tip them off beforehand so their system gets locked out and then 2 minutes later they get a call from the boss and they know what's going on here? How are you going to keep all this stuff secure? What are the protections from people just deleting a bunch of stuff? Whether it's off their email, whether it's off your servers, transferring that and taking it with them somewhere else. What are you going to do? How are you going to handle those sorts of situations? So I have some good news. If you were sitting there and worried, while I could go into some other risks, these really are the main ones. So we can get to the stuff now about how you stay safe. What are some concrete steps you can take? And yes, pretty much every one of these is steps that you can take today in some way, shape, or form. You may need the help of whether it's your internal IT team or an external IT resource like ourselves who are well-versed in this. We've gotten a ton of training over the last few months in this to even improve our skills, because a lot more is going into cybersecurity than it used to be. Again, this isn't just antivirus and backups anymore. It's a whole lot more than that. So let's talk about how you keep your organization safe. So everything begins for us and our methodology, and I highly recommend this, with a risk assessment. So in this risk assessment, and it can be something full like a big engagement where you're hiring somebody like our team to come in and interview, if you've got internal IT folks, interview them, interview management, do network scans, figure out all what's on the network, different cloud services you use, vet the security for that, really broad thing that's pretty labor intensive, down to like a 10-15 minute questionnaire that you're checking some boxes, and it doesn't give you the granular detail that you may need, but at least gives you some idea, like, oh, my email's a bit vulnerable, I'm going to need to do something about that. So again, it looks at what's your risk, where are you most vulnerable. And the reason we really want to do this is because it's impossible to get all the tools you're going to need for cybersecurity on a small business budget. It just is. We're all fighting tight budgets as it is for most of us, I think. And even if we weren't, we've got to spread that around. We can't just afford to get everything that comes in. So we have to look kind of on a case-by-case basis as to where are you most vulnerable, what are your biggest threats, and then align that with budgets and figure out where we need to spend. So that is the reason for the risk assessment. Plus, then you'll know everything, especially if you do a comprehensive one. You'll know where you're most vulnerable, because cybersecurity is really an ongoing journey. Fortunately, it's not a destination. It's not something anybody can just install on your network and you're secure or compliant. In fact, if anybody tells you that, run for the hills, kick them out of your office, because that's a bunch of snake oil. We can do things that will help protect and mitigate all these things. We can do things that will give a good amount of certainty, but it's always a game of cat and mouse. We're always having to adapt. Those of you that I've met with on cybersecurity in the past may remember me saying I reserve the right in 6 months from now to come back and say, hey, we need to change things up a bit, because again, these threats are evolving and changing. But there are now some more things that are essential in our tool bag, the risk assessment being one of them, that just was not even 12 to 24 months ago. So you can also put security first. And I'm going to warn you, you're going to get pushback because security is always a trade-off between convenience. Yeah, convenience and security. None of us like to go through metal detectors. None of us like to be patted down at the airport. It's why some of us got TSA PreCheck back in the days when we could travel, so we could go through a less onerous screening process. But none of us like this. I don't like the fact that we have two-factor for everything, which means I have to keep track of all this stuff, and enter 7 different keys to get into my systems every morning. But I tell you what, I like it a whole lot more than I love having to wake up to a ransomware breach or finding out that one of my clients was breached through my system that I control. You know, so as annoying as it is, that's really what we've got, and it really is necessary for protection. In fact, I think a couple of you I may have had this discussion with. I know I've had the discussion with a few clients where they've said, our people are going to push back. What do I tell them? And I'm going to just be blunt. You tell them, well, do you like working here? Because if we don't do these things, you probably won't have a job, because either we're going to be out of business or we're going to have to significantly cut back staff if something, a big cyber attack happens. And again, the unfortunate question is not a matter of, if it happens, but when, which is why we want to have these risk assessments, shore up what's most vulnerable, put in little tripwires and things that we can better monitor activity, and so we can get early warning signs and lock things down before something really gets out of hand. So it's maybe a breach, but it's very minor, and you notify the Attorney General, and you don't have to do anything more. You don't even have to notify your clients because no customer data was accessed, and you can just put it behind you. And mandatory employee training is definitely something in the realm of cybersecurity you need to do. Now, I will tell you, in my experience, I talked about it. I'm going to try not to be boring today. And most cybersecurity training, these little things, they're so boring. I mean, I'm very interested in cybersecurity for obvious reasons. And I'm bored to tears sometimes with those videos. So we are working on our own curriculum that hopefully will be more engaging. It's not going to be a happy time fun fest, but at least something that your employees won't dread. But that being said, this is something that needs to be done. I know for a few of you, we do either annual or twice a year webinars that give kind of your folks a security refresher, and we talk about trends and things like that with them. That's definitely something. But it's to the point now where I would recommend weekly or monthly little short videos that are sent out just as a refresher, because your employees didn't sign up to be IT folks. We recognize that, but the fact is they're on the front lines now in this, war against these cyber criminals. And these cyber criminals are big. I mean, these, we may think of the hacker as somebody in their mother's basement eating some Cheetos or something. But the fact is most hackers are employed either by nation states like Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. And in fact, the U.S. even employs our own teams as well. Or these are like major enterprises. I mean, these folks and these ransomware attacks make millions of dollars in a few days. This is big business, and that's why it continues to happen. So let's talk about a new security model, Zero Trust. This has been around for a while, but in terms of small business feasibility, it's pretty new in the arena here. And I mentioned the kind of failed model of the castle, and so this is what's replacing it. And the reasons are pretty clear, especially why it's doing so much now with remote work. So Zero Trust assumes that anything on a network can't be trusted, and you have to explicitly grant it permissions here. And you want to make those permissions as limited as possible. So I'll give the example of a law firm that has, it's a multi-practice law firm. So, you've got your litigation and you've got, we'll say, your estates and trusts. Well, do the people on the litigation side need access to any of the estates and trust data? Probably not, right? So we need to silo off that stuff and make sure that those folks don't have it. So then if litigation somehow gets a ransomware attack, at least we know that it's limited and there's certain areas of the network that if we can determine, hey, this is the only place it affected, we know that then this was what the damage was limited to. This model even goes to things like software updates and installations, in the sense that with the SolarWinds hack, it was a software update that was released by that software company that perpetuated this and allowed the hackers to gain access to what they really wanted, which was these government agencies and these big Fortune 500 companies. So we even have to be wary about this stuff and kind of vet it and test it and be careful. And The zero trust model can be a bit of a pain, I recognize, especially since generally what we need to do is a top to bottom review of the organization and figure out who needs access to what and try to limit that as much as possible. But boy, is it a lot better when you're not having to worry about certain things of somebody getting access to something or an entire server being encrypted because, everybody had access to all the shares. That sort of thing. And the other reason that we're looking at this model is, of course, remote work's a big one. With people connecting from their own devices. But also, again, I mentioned hackers can live in a network 6 to 9 months. We like to think that they're going to announce their presence, but that's not smart of them to do that. They want to gather information being undetected first, and then maybe finally release some ransomware or something to collect a big payout, in addition to whatever they've gleaned elsewhere. But with the zero trust model, what we remember is that a computer that is just perfectly fine today, not infected, we can guarantee it. Like there's no infection, there's no hackers in there, it's safe and secure, could be infected tomorrow potentially. Somebody could bypass it. Again, it's a game of cat and mouse. So with the zero trust, we're able to better isolate, better look for that thing, and just assume that anything can be turned into a weapon against us. So yes, it's paranoid, but also yes, it is by far the model that best suits us currently. You can also look at new tools. This is a big area. It's something we'll be talking about. I'm not going to get into specifics because, again, the tools just vary based on organization size, need, all sorts of things. But there's definitely quite a few new things in the tool bag that we need to start deploying. If we're not going to deploy all of them to everybody, but a few of them are going to be needed. And what these tools do, instead of looking like traditional antivirus software that looks at just a database of all sorts of different viruses, when you've got tens of thousands of new viruses being released every day, you've got hackers that don't have to rely on viruses but work on exploits and backdoors into systems, what you're doing is looking for behavior. So for example, one of these tools will sit on your network and monitor activity on all the computers, and it's just sitting there, collecting info until one day one of your programs that always accesses the same 5 folders goes out to tries to access the management folder. Maybe it even fails because it doesn't have proper permissions. But that tool will say, well, now wait a minute. That's not right. That's new and different. Why is it doing that? I better trigger an alert. And then a human being can look at that and say, okay, hey, is there a problem? So these tools usually are going to automatically block instead of automatically allow, with an option with only allowing after IT can review it. Your IT team, whether it's internal or external provider like ourselves, can review that. And I realize for some of you, maybe that's not fun, because I know some of you have asked us more for permissive things and just allowing things through because you're tired of legitimate things being blocked. But guys, this is just the world we live in. We've got to be smarter. We've got to crack down more. And all it takes is one thing to slip through now, and then to cause a whole lot of pain. And we don't want that for you. We don't want that for us either. So this is a big thing. And these tools are usually backed up by a 24/7 security operations center, a trained team of cybersecurity professionals. Looking at these things too, because as good as machines are, as good as artificial intelligence is to help us analyze all these thousands of alerts, human beings are still just great at pattern matching and recognizing this stuff. And it's good to have a trained person look at it and take action one way or another, whether it's, oh no, we might have a breach of the network, or, oh, this is a false positive, let me go ahead and allow this. Password security, I'm going to be talking about this, I'm sure, until either we replace passwords, which is a beautiful dream of mine, or I'm hit by a bus, because this is something that continually is one of the easiest backdoors. With the statistics that I've seen, say 7 out of 10 small business employees have had a password compromised in one way, shape, or form. Doesn't mean necessarily that it was like their work password, but with people reusing the same passwords, often what will happen is some other site will get breached, and then they've got the keys to the kingdom because we reuse these passwords. So you need to enable multi-factor authentication everywhere you can possibly. So Office 365, all these different places. Yes, it's a little bit of a hassle. I recognize it. It's not always fun. It can cause some compatibility issues here and there that we have to work around, but it's needed. And also this multi-factor can sometimes be referred to as two-factor. So if you see these, they're pretty interchangeable. Multi-factor is technically slightly different, but for our purposes, we don't need to get that technical. Just know if you see 2FA, two-factor, multi-factor, and you can enable it, that's something you're going to want to do sooner rather than later. We need to be requiring password managers for employees. Ideally, this is something that is managed by your organization, so either your internal IT team or something like Parkway Tech provides, because then that way you've got access to those passwords if the employee departs. But even so, there's no way that even a dozen or 2 dozen passwords that your average employee is going to have can remotely be remembered well when they need to be unique and difficult to guess. So that's where password managers come in. I've got something on the order of over 600 passwords currently in my database, some of which could probably be retired. But there's no way I could get by without a password manager there. And you also need to make sure to use dark web scanning services to check for exposed credentials. So what these services do, I'm going to explain real quickly the dark web. You probably heard this term tossed around. You may be confused by what the heck it even is. So the dark web is a part of the internet, but it's kind of segregated off, and you have to know exactly how to get there, and you probably have to know somebody. But it's where all the cyber criminals hang out and trade information and sell tools and credit card numbers that they've stolen and passwords that they've compromised or hacked out and all that sort of stuff. And so what these dark web scanning services do, because they're able to get access to these systems, they will scan and they'll look for, like, for example, our email domain is parkwaytech.com. So they'll look for anything from parkwaytech.com in any sort of, any of these forums where these are posted. And then they'll alert me if it's found, and they'll say, yeah, it was, Chris at parkwaytech.com, and here's the password we found, or, we found your social security number was leaked. And then that way you can take action. So you can change that password. Again, ideally you're already using separate passwords, so it's just that one password that has to be changed. But unfortunately for a lot of folks, I know, because I've seen it done, where people will go in and in a meeting even with me have to change their banking password as they hear about this. But it's the reason we need separate passwords. But these dark web scanning services will help give you a heads up. And then, doesn't mean it hasn't already been used, but in most cases that buys you a bit of time and certainly makes you aware of, hey, this happened, and to keep an eye, on those accounts for the next few months. Now, policies and planning. This is a big area. This is one that I'm just going to be honest with you. We can't do this for you, but we can guide you. We can give you a roadmap. We can help you through this thing. But this is definitely putting the proper policies and plans in place for things like, disasters is needed. I mean, you need to do it before something happens, because the best time to prepare for a hurricane is not 2 days before the hurricane. It's months before hurricane season starts. You get your plan into place, and sure, in the heat of battle, when a hurricane actually comes, you may find you've left some things out or you need to tweak some things, but having a plan is better than nothing. And having policies in place too to enforce these requirements for employees, to say, hey, employees, you can't just go and sign up for any cloud service that you think is going to be helpful for your job, because that could expose us to all sorts of risk and liability. You have to go through these steps to get something approved. And nobody likes red tape. I don't like it. But this sort of stuff is necessary, and especially with remote work. We talked about if an employee's terminated or if they leave during while they're working remotely, how do you handle that? You probably need to look at your termination procedures and put a new one in place for remote workers and how you're going to handle that. Again, we've got some templates. We know some major things to focus on, but it's still something that legal counsel and HR always need to vet, because I probably should have began the webinar this way, but hopefully most of you know I'm neither an attorney nor a certified HR person. So I can't give you legal advice or any HR advice. All I can give you is technology advice. And ensure these policies support the new normal. So make sure that, if you haven't looked at these, a lot of you are going to be with remote workers and things for the foreseeable future, or you might be looking at it even if you're not now, and saying, hey, well, we could, maybe get some people from other areas of the country that we wouldn't have access to in our talent pool here locally. So make sure you've got these policies in place. And there's many things we could get in to cover. I've got some basic guides and stuff for you guys, but this is really one big area where, we can help out, but we can't do it for you, because these things are definitely unique. What one law firm, what one small law firm does is going to be different from what another small law firm needs. And honestly, just plan for the worst. These need to be, plans for knowing where your backups are and how you would restore and the estimated time to recovery. Knowing, what protections you have on systems. All these sorts of things are very good. And also, I'm going to tell you something, they're probably going to keep your cyber insurance premiums a little bit lower too, because we've started to see cyber insurance carriers ask for more and more. And if you already have that and can provide them like just a nice documentation, virtual binder of stuff, they're going to love you. and it's going to be that much easier. And also, you're more likely, if something does happen, to get a payout and get full coverage there. Now, finally, adjusting budgets, the fun part of it, right? So a greater amount of your technology spending, you just need to know, is going to be on cyber defense and cybersecurity. I don't see this ever going back because the vulnerabilities continue to get more and more as we're more and more connected to the internet. We've got remote work. So that may mean for some of you that obviously 2021, we've already started, budgets are probably already set. So nobody on this call, I'm expecting to, write out a big check tomorrow. Again, this is a journey. This is planning that you can go ahead and do and start to figure out where you're going to allocate this. So for some of you, you're going to try to find more budget here in the coming months, and certainly, hopefully, something for by 2022 at the latest. For others, this is going to mean, okay, we're going to have to make some tough decisions in our technology spending and reallocate some budget here. The cost to provide these services is falling, but it can only go so low. We're seeing a massive demand in cybersecurity and fewer qualified workers available. These folks are usually making like six figures pretty easily. In fact, we're working in our own internal team and getting several cybersecurity certifications this year, and I'm already having to set aside thousands of dollars in 2022 because these guys are going to need some big raises if I want to keep them. That's just those are the breaks, unfortunately. It's not inexpensive, but the cost of an attack is just catastrophic in most cases. It's certainly a bigger annoyance than it was because, again, more forensic analysis needs to be done in most cases. It's less that we can say, oh, yeah, somebody just logged into your email account. We'll boot them and you'll be okay and go on with your day. More stuff needs to be done now, and ideally you're going to need to have some tools in place to help detect this stuff early. So those are the things you can do, the tools, the policies, and planning, starting with the risk assessment, putting security first, that password security, policies and planning. Let's talk about getting you secure. This is what I'm going to end with, and then I'm going to take a look, see if there are any questions. I know sometimes, this is a lot I cover in these things, so some of you may need some time to process, which is why you'll have my information here in just a moment so you can follow up later. But we're going to be meeting with each of our fully managed clients to talk about, obviously this will be virtual, but talk about some specifics that we already know about, some things that we may need to do to figure out more things on their network so we can better provide a risk assessment, talking about what a risk assessment looks like, what the costs are for that to begin, and maybe even some tools that we already know, hey, we'd already recommend you implement this, and here's the cost, and here's what this looks like. But we're going to be talking about that, determine a risk, budget, reallocation of spending recommendations. Again, everything's going to be determined by that risk because there's no way that any of you, even with good sized small business budgets, can afford every tool, and you shouldn't have to, but we can figure out where you're most vulnerable, what's going to make the most sense, and what's going to be the best use of resources there. And ultimately, we're all in this together. At Parkway Tech, we spent the last few months reviewing our policies, redoing a lot of things. We're still making moves to make ourselves continually more secure. Again, this is a journey. It's not a destination. It's a long-term process. Things change, but it is something you can get a handle on. It is something that you can then sleep fairly easy at night knowing that, hey, I'm pretty protected. Things can happen, sure, but we have a plan in place. We know how we're going to respond if something happens. We know we've got the adequate protections. We know we're not going to be sued into oblivion if we have a breach or something. We have this here. So that's the thing I'll leave you. It's a scary world out there. There is no doubt, but cybersecurity is not optional. It's not something that antivirus and backup alone can do, but it definitely is something that is something that is doable even for small businesses. You're not going to be like the Pentagon, but you can definitely be a little bit secure. So if you've got any questions, you can post them in the chat or through the Q&A here in GoToWebinar. I need to do a slide next time to show you guys how to use that, but hopefully you can figure it out. But if you can't, or if you get questions later, my contact information is there. Feel free to reach out to me. Happy to speak with you, whether you're a client or not, about this. If you've got an existing IT provider and they haven't spoken to you much about cybersecurity, it's a big thing, and they need to be in discussion. We're going to be doing monthly webinars on cybersecurity, as well as hopefully a weekly video series on that's a little bit shorter topics. This entire year, probably certainly I imagine we'll go into 2022, but we've just got 2021 planned. In fact, we will have another webinar in February. Look for details for that to come to your inboxes soon. And these are always recorded, so if you can't make it, still register. Then you can always watch it and get the good information later. And I will tell you, March's webinar that was supposed to be in February, which is why I already know the topic, is going to be a live hacking demonstration with a vendor of ours that's really skilled in that. So you're going to get to see that. None of your computers are going to be hacked or anything. It's a test system of theirs, but you're going to get to see how easy it is for these hackers to breach these sorts of things. So with that, let me go ahead and pull this out. And I'm going to go ahead and pause showing my screen. And I'm going to give you guys just a bit here, check to see if there are any questions. Oh. So first of all, I'm going to ask people in the chat to say, can you actually hear me?